Kael'thor's claws struck the floor once, and no one answered. 1,200 seats climbed away from him into a dark he had never seen the top of, and every one of them was empty. The chamber's soft blue glow hummed the way it always had, patient and indifferent. The same light his grandfather's grandfather had stood under. It should have been full. It should have been loud with delegates arguing over supply routes and border claims, the way it had been every day of his 91 years in service. Instead, there was a small dark recorder resting on the podium rail, and it was playing. 47 seconds of nothing came out of it first. Not static, silence, the deliberate kind, the kind that has been measured and timed and delivered on purpose. Then a voice, flat and human, said 5 words into the empty rings of seats. The threshold is closed. Kael'thor's 4 jaws did not click. That was the wrong thing, the thing he would think about later and never be able to explain. His mouth always clicked when he was amused, and it did not click now. He looked up at the ceiling, at the dark he'd never bothered to question, and for the first time in 91 years of never losing, he did not know what to say back to an empty room. No fleet had answered him. No vote had been called. No one at all had come. Behind him, in the highest ring, something moved. A shape small enough to be a shadow, folded into a chair meant for a much larger species. "I told you," said Elder Solari. Her voice was paper-thin and it still carried. 900 years, and I told you, I wish I could tell you this was the end of it. It wasn't. Stay close, because the 47 seconds you just heard took 31 years to build, and nobody in that chamber knew it was coming. 72 hours earlier, the watch was already ticking. It sat on the wrist of a woman most of the chamber hadn't bothered to learn the name of. A silver-cased thing worn pale at the edges, its second hand moving faster than any modern instrument needed to. 47 clicks a minute. She had worn it every day for 31 years, and in all that time exactly one person had ever asked her why. Admiral Izara Vex had not answered him then either. The conclave's spire had opened for its session the ordinary way, with the speaker's chime and the low shuffle of 1,000 delegates finding their seats. High Marshal Kael'thor took the floor first, the way he always did, his ceremonial cloak dragging 6 defeated banners across obsidian that had been polished by servants of species who no longer existed. He ran 2 claws across his left brow, once the way he did when he already knew he'd won. 43 systems, he said, and his voice needed no amplification to reach the highest ring. 43 violations of Council-recognized space, committed by a species that has been granted latitude it has never earned. The Earth Directorate calls itself an observer. It behaves like an owner. A murmur went through the seats, the kind that meant agreement, not debate. Consul Thraxi stood at Kael'thor's shoulder with a data tablet he wasn't reading, young enough for a Drakari that his scales still had the shine that faded with age, and he watched the human delegation the way he watched anything unfamiliar carefully. 387 delegates had already pledged their vote before the session opened. Only Solari's ring had abstained, and without understanding why he bothered, there were 3 of them. Their formal dress looked decades out of fashion next to the chamber's furs and battle cloaks. One was gray-haired, and she did not stand when Kael'thor finished. She let the silence sit for 4 full seconds before she rose, which in a chamber built to reward speed was its own kind of insult. Admiral Vex placed her palm flat on the podium rail. The scar across it caught the blue light. Her wristwatch ticked into the quiet 47 clicks a minute. The same rhythm she had carried through 31 years of waiting rooms and losing votes and writing drafts of a treaty nobody had wanted to sign. She did not open the folio under her arm. She had not needed it in years. "High Marshal Kael'thor," she said, and her voice did not rise to fill the room. It simply arrived in it. The Earth Directorate recognizes no authority of this council. We recognize no authority of the Drakari Empire. High Marshal Kael'thor, the Drakari Empire, and all its representatives are declared persona non grata, effective immediately. All human-held borders are sealed. For a moment, nobody in 1,200 seats made a sound. Then Kael'thor laughed, a hard clanking noise that bounced off the obsidian and came back wrong. "This is a joke. You have no fleet. You have 4 minutes. Vex said. In 47 seconds, the watch kept ticking. Nobody moved. Nobody in that chamber understood yet that a program begun 300 years ago passed hand to hand through 6 generations of admirals who never once made the evening news, had just finished counting down to 0. Thraxi looked at his tablet, and somewhere in the back of his memory a classified brief he'd dismissed 2 years ago as paranoia started clawing its way back to the surface. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Solari, in the highest ring, folded her small hands together and said nothing at all, which for a woman who had been warning this exact room for 900 years was its own kind of answer. Kelthor's claws found his brow again. He didn't notice he was doing it twice in the same conversation. 4 minutes, he repeated, like the number was a joke that hadn't landed yet. He had no way of knowing it was the last thing he would say in that chamber, that anyone would remember correctly. Kelthor did not wait for the vote to close. He turned from the podium and gave the order himself, the way he always had, because in 91 years, no one had ever made him wait for permission twice. The fleet moved on schedule. 15 capital ships, 40 support vessels, 300,000 troops folded into transport hulls built to break a planet's spine if the planet argued. They crossed the first boundary point, clean sensors reading nothing but empty space and old starlight. 72 hours. That was the window Vex had given him without saying so, and he had spent every hour of it certain the silence meant surrender. He was wrong about that too. In a command nexus hidden behind the mass shadow of a planet the Council had never bothered to survey, a woman named Okoi watched a 12-meter display refresh every 4 seconds. She was young for the rank she held, and she had spent 3 years training for a moment she'd been told might never come. First boundary, clean, she said. No resistance. Commander Reyes stood behind her, hands folded, watching the same numbers she was. Let them cross the second one. Sir, let them cross it! At the second boundary, the lead ship's telemetry dropped by half a second, then came back. Nothing anyone watching from the bridge of that ship would have noticed. Okoi noticed. She always noticed the half seconds. That was the job. Confirm Gate 2, she said. And somewhere behind the display, a relay she'd never seen and would never be told the location of answered back with a single green light. The Drukhari fleet crossed the third boundary at what its own clocks read as hour 8. By hour 21 it had stopped transmitting. Not destroyed, not damaged. Simply quiet. The way a phone goes quiet when the line on the other end has been cut rather than dropped. Thraxi felt it before Kelthor did. He was reading the same feed the High Marshal was, the one still showing green icons where the fleet should have been reporting position, weapon status, fuel burn, the ordinary chatter of an advancing force. Instead there was nothing. Not static. A held breath. High Marshal Thraxi's voice cracked on the second word, which had never happened to him in a briefing before. The lead elements aren't responding to hail. Come relay failure, Kelthor said. Reroute through the secondary array. Thraxi rerouted. The secondary array answered with the same nothing. 2 years earlier, in a briefing room 3 levels below the spire, a junior analyst had handed Thraxi a file on something called the Veal Accord and told him it was probably nothing. An old human program, 300 years old, filed under infrastructure and never updated. Thraxi had read 4 pages of it and closed it, because infrastructure reports from a species with no visible fleet weren't worth a young consul's time. He was starting to remember more of those 4 pages than he wanted to. It's not a relay failure, he said, and for the first time in his career he said something to Kelthor that Kelthor hadn't asked for. The High Marshal's 4 jaws clicked, but slower than usual. Explain? There's a program, human. I dismissed it. 2 years ago. It's called the Veal Accord, and I don't know what it does, but I know it's not new, and I know it's exactly where our fleet just stopped answering. Kelthor ran 2 claws across his brow. Once then, a breath later again. Back in the spire, the chamber had not adjourned. She stood at the podium with her palms still flat against the rail, the watch still ticking under the cuff of her sleeve, and she said nothing at all. 900 delegates sat in a silence that had nothing procedural about it, watching the human delegation the way you watch a door after you've heard something move on the other side of it. Vex had not sat down, because she had already said everything that mattered, and the only thing left to do was wait for the numbers to catch up to the words. Solari left her seat in the highest ring. It took her a long time to descend. She was old, and the stairs of the conclave spire had been built for species with longer legs, but she crossed the floor until she stood near enough to the human delegation to be heard without shouting. 300 years, she said, not to Vex, but loud enough that the ring nearest her could hear it. I have sat in this chamber for 900 of them. I told my successor, and she told hers that the humans were not what the maps said they were. Nobody believed an elder who could be outvoted. You were the only vote that mattered to us, Vex said quietly. I did not cast a vote today. No? Vex agreed. You didn't need to. A murmur went through the chamber. Not agreement this time, something closer to fear finding its footing. 1,200 seats, and every delegate in them had spent the last hour assuming the outcome of a war that hadn't started, because the last war anyone in that room remembered starting had involved fleets and fire and casualties counted in the tens of thousands. They were coming from the systems the fleet had failed to enter: merchant convoys, colonial administrators, a Mavari trade envoy who happened to be passing near the third boundary and reported with some confusion. This one had involved a woman standing still and a watch that wouldn't stop ticking. At hour 30 of the Drakhari advance, the reports reaching the spire were no longer coming from the fleet at all. The Drakhari warships appeared to be sitting motionless in open space, engines running, going nowhere. They're not fighting, the envoy's message read. They're just stopped. Thraxi read that line to Kael'thor twice before the High Marshal responded. Ships do not simply stop, Kael'thor said. These have... Kael'thor's cloak, woven from 6 defeated banners, brushed the floor as he turned away from the display and toward the empty ring of seats where the human delegation had been sitting an hour ago. They were gone. Vex had left the chamber sometime during the 30th hour, without ceremony, without another word. The way she had entered, 31 years of council sessions no one had thought worth attending. Find her, Kael'thor said. He was looking at the ceiling again, at the dark above the rings that no one had ever mapped because no one had ever needed to, and for the second time in one day he found himself standing in a room built to make him feel eternal. She's not hiding, High Marshal. Thraxi's voice had gone very flat. She told you exactly what was going to happen. She just didn't tell you when it would stop being a threat and start being finished. Kael'thor did not answer that. Feeling instead like the last man in it who hadn't yet understood the joke, somewhere behind Jupiter's long shadow, Okoye watched her display tick over to hour 36 and said, to no one in particular, Gate 3, 4, and 5 confirmed. They're not stopping to fight us. Reyes nodded once. They're stopping because there's nowhere left to go. Kael'thor found her on the observation deck above the spire's western dock, and she did not turn around when the door opened. You could have told the chamber how long it would take, he said. Instead, you let us find out ship by ship. You didn't ask me how long. Vex kept her eyes on the dock below, where a handful of council staff were quietly reassigning cargo, manifest that no longer had anywhere to go. You asked me to leave. I am asking you now. She turned. The watch was still on her wrist, still ticking, and for the first time since he'd met her that morning, Kael'thor found himself listening to it instead of her voice. It isn't a weapon, she said. That's the part your intelligence reports got wrong. Nobody built something to destroy your fleet. We built something to close a door. Your ships aren't damaged, High Marshal. They're standing outside one. Then open it. It was never locked to keep you out specifically. It was built 300 years ago, before your empire existed, because a species with no fleet and no army needed a way to be left alone. We didn't design it to fight anyone. We designed it so we'd never have to. Kael'thor's claws found his brow, and this time he seemed to notice himself doing it, and stopped. 91 years, he said. You lost the idea that a vote was ever the thing that mattered. Below them, a Drakhari support cruiser drifted into dock, its hull scorched from nothing at all. Its crew, disembarking in the slow. I have never lost a vote. You didn't lose a vote today either. Vex's voice didn't soften, but something in it changed register, the way a lawyer's does when she's no longer arguing a case and has started explaining one instead. Stunned shuffle of soldiers who had trained for a war that had simply declined to happen. Thraxi arrived on the deck a minute later, tablet still in hand, and for once he didn't wait for permission to speak. High Marshal. There's something you should see before you decide what to do next. He turned the tablet so both of them could see it. A report from a Torvani trade delegation 2 systems over, filed within the last hour. The Torvani had tried, out of what they described as scientific curiosity, to fly a civilian shuttle across the same boundary the Drakhari fleet had stalled at. The shuttle had passed through without incident. They're not stopping everyone, Thraxi said. They're stopping you, Vex said nothing, which told Kael'thor everything. It reads intent, Thraxi went on, quieter now, like the shape of what he was saying scared him more than he expected. Not species, not ships, intent whatever's out there, it's not a wall. It's a judgment. For a long moment nobody on the deck spoke. The watch ticked. Below them, Ground crews kept moving cargo that no longer had a destination because the war they'd prepared for had ended before the first shot, and nobody standing there yet knew what to call what had happened instead. Vex reached into her coat and produced a small folded card, plain, unremarkable, the kind of thing a diplomat carries and forgets she's carrying. She held it out to Kael'thor. I brought this 31 years ago, the first time I sat in that chamber as a junior attaché. Nobody looked at twice, she said. I've carried it to every session since. I never had a reason to use it until today. Kael'thor did not take it. What is it? A copy of the first draft, the one I wrote when I was 28, before anyone in the directorate believed the council would ever need to hear it. It says the same 5 words the recording will play for you later. I wrote them before I had any proof they would matter. I carried them anyway. He still didn't take the card, but he didn't look away from it either. 3 systems over, in a stretch of space no council chart had ever bothered naming. The second wave of Drakari reinforcement ships crossed into range of the boundary and stopped exactly where the first wave had. Word of it reached the spire within the hour, relayed through channels that no longer felt urgent so much as final. Solari met them on the deck without anyone summoning her. She moved slower than she had that morning, the climb from the highest ring finally catching up with her small frame, but her voice hadn't lost its edge. You keep asking why now, she said to Kael'thor. You should be asking why not sooner. They could have closed this door the day your empire took its first system. They didn't. They waited. 31 years she carried a card nobody asked to read. 900, I sat in a chamber nobody asked to hear. The only thing that changed today is that you gave them a reason they couldn't ignore. I gave an ultimatum, Kael'thor said. Nations give ultimatums. Theirs has never needed to. Kael'thor looked past both of them, toward the dock, toward the scorched cruiser and the ground crews, and the war that hadn't happened, and for the first time all day he found himself thinking not about the vote he'd expected to win. It is how power speaks. It is how your power speaks. Solari's small hand closed over the folded card in Vex's palm, not quite taking it, just resting there. But about the 90 other systems his empire had taken in 91 years, how loud every one of those campaigns had been, how much they had cost to be seen and feared and counted. None of it had made a sound today. You're looking at her. The words hadn't finished landing when the recorder on the observation deck's comm panel clicked once, unbidden, and a voice neither of them had heard yet, young, human. That was the part he couldn't file anywhere in 91 years of experience. I need to speak to your government, he said finally. Not this chamber. Whoever gave the order. Vex closed her hand around the card and put it away again, unused. You already have, she said. Carrying the flat calm of someone reading from a card he'd memorized under duress came through the speaker, addressed to no one in the room and everyone listening past it. This is fleet coordination, confirming full closure across all sectors. The threshold is closed. Thraxy's tablet slipped an inch in his grip. Kael'thor did not move at all. Nobody on the observation deck moved for a long moment after the broadcast ended. The recorder clicked off on its own, the way it had clicked on, and the silence that followed it was not the same silence as before. It had a shape to it now. Kael'thor reached out and picked up a service mug someone had left on the rail hours earlier, cold coffee gone flat inside it, and drank from it without seeming to notice what it was. It was the most ordinary thing he had done all day, and he did it now, of all moments, with 3 people watching him and an empire's worth of silence pressing down from the dark above the spire. Then he set the mug down and looked at Vex. 91 years, he said again, but this time it wasn't a boast. I have taken 9 systems by force. I have never once needed to ask an enemy what they were, because I could always see it. Armor, numbers, range, you have none of those things I can point to. No, Vex agreed. Then what are you? She didn't answer right away. She reached into her coat instead and found the same folded card she had offered him an hour before, and this time she didn't hold it out. She simply opened it and read it. The way she must have read it 31 years ago in an empty office no one had thought worth funding. We are the species that built a door instead of a wall, she said. A wall says stay out. A door says you may knock, and we may not answer, and there is nothing you can do about either. Solari, still standing close enough that her small hand rested on the rail beside Vex's, spoke the answer Kael'thor hadn't asked for yet. She carried that card on paper, the elder said, for 31 years, not on a data slate, not filed anywhere your intelligence services could reach it. Paper cannot be deleted. High Marshal, it cannot be locked. It cannot be made to disappear by anyone with better weapons than the person holding it. Kael'thor looked at the card in Vex's hand, plain and creased and unremarkable, and something in his face changed that had nothing to do with anger. Thraxi broke the quiet before it could stretch too long. High Marshal, command is asking what to tell the fleet. Tell them to hold position, Kael'thor said, and his voice had gone quieter than Thraxi had ever heard it. Tell them there's nothing beyond that line worth the cost of finding out what happens if they push. No ships burned, no systems fell. No treaty was signed, because there was no one left in that chamber with the authority to negotiate a door that had already decided on its own terms, to close. Vex folded the card away, unread by anyone but her and the elder beside her, and turned toward the dock stairs. You were listening to the wrong part of the sentence. She left him there with Thraxi and the empty mug in Solari's small hand still resting on the rail, and she walked the long corridor back toward the human delegation's transport without looking behind her. Where are you going? Kael'thor asked. Home, she said. I told you once already, because there was nothing behind her that needed her to. The Conclave Spire reconvened one final time that day, though barely a third of its seats filled. There was no vote to take. The speaker read a brief procedural note into a record that had suddenly, after 9,000 years, stopped feeling permanent and adjourned the session without ceremony. Kael'thor did not attend. He stood instead on the same observation deck, alone this time, watching the last of the scorched cruisers dock below him, and it was there that the words finally arranged themselves into something he could say out loud, even with no one left to hear them. No fleet answered us. No vote was needed. No war was fought, he said at once. Plainly, the way a man says a thing he has finally stopped arguing with. Behind him, unnoticed until it wasn't, Solari had returned. She had a way of doing that, appearing at the exact moment a silence was ready to be filled. The Veil Accord isn't a weapon, she said, echoing words she'd said before but meaning them differently now, and it was never a wall either. It's a door. You did. 3 days later, no one in the Spire ever agreed on exactly which day the war had technically ended, since no war had technically been declared to begin with. A Torvani merchant ship passed through the boundary that had once stalled 15 Drakari capital ships. They have always been able to close it, High Marshal. They were only ever waiting for someone to give them a reason. Kael'thor turned the mug over once in his hand and set it down for the last time. I gave them that reason, he said. Yes, said Solari, and reported nothing unusual at all. The door had never been closed to everyone, only to the one empire that had spent 91 years assuming a door was the same thing as a wall. Thraxi kept the recording. Not the official one filed with the Council Archive, his own copy, taken on the observation deck without asking anyone's permission. The only thing of that day he chose to remember on his own terms. He played it back exactly once, weeks later, alone. 47 seconds of silence came first. Same as always. Then the recorded voice, young, human, steady under whatever weight the words were carrying, said the 5 words that had ended an empire's certainty without spending a single life to do it. The threshold is closed, and underneath it, so quiet most listeners would have missed it entirely, a small mechanical sound kept its own rhythm the whole way through. Not loud, present. The same ticking Kael'thor had once dismissed as a primitive trinket worn by an unimportant delegate from an unimportant species. The watch was still ticking. Thraxi turned the recording off. He did not play it again. Somewhere across a boundary no chart would ever mark correctly. A small silver-cased watch kept time on the wrist of a woman walking home. 31 years of waiting finally spent, its second hand moving the way it always had, steady, unhurried. He set his tablet down on a desk that had, for the first time in 2 years, nothing classified on it worth dismissing, and he did not run his claws across his brow, because that had never been his tale to begin with, in no rush at all to be somewhere else.